Welcome to part 2 of my Objects in the Rearview Mirror series. Part 1, if you want to check it out, was about the Standard of Ur, an object in the British Museum, and we're sticking with the British Museum today, and we're going to be looking at a little statue of a Roman lictor. And here he is. I'll give you a more zoomed out one in a minute. And you can see, as the British Museum describes him, bronze figure of a lictor, magistrate's attendant, from about 20 BC to about AD 20. Now, I have to say, they give no details about why they choose that date, and I haven't been able to find any evidence that supports a date like that, but we'll just have to take it at face value as far as they're concerned. And then the lictor wears a toga and carries the fasces, symbolizing the magistrate's authority. He's a little figure, he's only a little over 7 inches tall, but he carries an awful lot of symbolism. So let's start with a quote from Gallius, his Noctes Atticae. The meaning and origin of the word lictor and the varying opinions of Valgius Rufus and Tullius Tiro on that subject. Valgius Rufus, in the second of the books, which he entitled On Matters Investigated by Letter, says that the lictor was so called from legando, or binding, because when the magistrates of the Roman people had given orders that anyone should be beaten with rods, his legs and arms were always fastened and bound by an attendant, and therefore that the member of the college of attendants who had the duty of binding him was called a lictor. And he quotes as evidence on this subject Marcus Tullius. By the way, that's Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, citing these words from the speech entitled In Defense of Gaius Rabirius, Lictor, bind his hands. This is what Valgius says. Now, I, for my part, agree with him, but Tullius Tiro, the freedman of Marcus Cicero, wrote that the lictor got his name from Linus or Lycium. For, says he, those men who were in attendance upon the magistrates were girt across with a kind of girdle called limus. But if there is anyone who thinks that what Tiro said is more probable, because the first syllable in lictor is long, like that of Lycium, but in the word ligo is short, that has nothing to do with the case. For in lictor, from legando, lictor from legendo, vitor from viendo, tutor from tuendo, and structor from struendo, the vowels, which were originally short, are lengthened. Now, the reason why I quote this particular passage is to bring out two things. Firstly, the lack of certainty we have from any of our sources. Even the Romans don't know for sure. They're offering theories. Maybe it came from this, maybe it came from that. Just because it's an ancient source doesn't mean we should treat it as verbatim truth. They might be closer to events than we are, but often not that close, and they also are theorizing. The second point I wanted to make here is we've all been pronouncing this word wrong, strictly speaking, though the English form of the guy's name is lictor, based on the discussion saying, well, in fact, the Latin has a long vowel sound at the start. So really, we should all have been saying it's something more like lictor, lictor, or lictor, something along those lines. But, well, the English pronunciation has become set with the short vowel, even though that actually isn't correct. Now, before we go on to talk a bit more about the object itself and Roman fasces and lictors, I just want to bring out just how often you'll see them once you start looking. So I was in Paris just in January of this year, and I went to visit the Military Museum and the Tomb of Napoleon, and just standing outside in one of the corridors, so the open-air corridors, there was this statue. There was no label attached to it to describe exactly who she was, but you can see there a female figure with the rods and the axe. And this was on the same trip from a visit to the Louvre Museum. And you can see here the figure of justice carrying the fasces and scales presents a portrait of the deceased. And this one comes from the 1600s. So this Roman symbol comes down through the ages. And of course, one of the ways we know it best is because the Italian fascists adopted it as their symbol. In fact, if you have been thinking for just a moment, you'll notice that the word fasces, the rods and the axe that the lictor is carrying, is the direct source of our word fascist, which Mussolini adopted in about 1919. Now, this is a Italian biplane, but from World War II, made by Fiat, and got a close-up for you there. You can see they have the Roman fasces with the rods and the axe blade on the side of this plane. And then one of the things you have to watch out for, even when you're visiting Rome itself, is not every picture you will see of fasces comes from ancient Rome because of this period of Mussolini and the fascists. So this picture you see here is actually a 20th century representation of the fasces from the viaduct of the Vatican State Railway line. Now, I want to give people fair acknowledgement. I got this photo from the website that belongs to David Lown, so I'm going to give him some free advertising here. This is what he says in his website. I'm an art historian from Cambridge, England. Since 2001, I've lived in Rome, where I run private walking tours. So if you're going to be visiting Rome and you want an educated person to give you some interesting walking tours, Google David Lown, and that's hopefully paying him back for using his photo here. Now, elsewhere, some of you will probably recognize this. This is from the American city Cincinnati, because Cincinnati is named for the Roman dictator Cincinnatus, who famously took the dictatorship, then, as soon as he had dealt with the crisis, returned to his plough. And of course, you can see there in his right hand, he has the rods and the axe. These are some photos I took from a visit to the Texas state capitol in Austin. And on the left here, I'll zoom in so you can tell what he's talking about. There is no danger of a surprise when the Rangers are between us and the enemy. Now, you'll notice who said that. General Braxton Bragg, a Confederate general. And on the right, the Terry Rangers have done all that could be expected or required of soldiers. Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Confederate States. Yes, you might notice that at the Texas state capitol, that whole business of taking down monuments with Confederate symbolism has not happened. And, well, there in the middle again, you see the rods and the axe blade. This photo is one I took at the Tennessee state capitol. And you'll see on either side of the speaker's stand, you see the rods and the axe blades again, with the axe blades look a bit funny, and they are double-headed axes, which we never see in Roman fasces, and they also seem to have some spare points poking up the top, but nevertheless clearly recognizable as fasces. And then we have perhaps one of the most famous monuments in the United States, and there is no axe blade, but you'll see under his hands, Abraham Lincoln has the rods. Now, as you're going to be learning today, it's actually not that unusual to see the fasces without an axe blade. So this is not historically inaccurate, and in many ways it's quite appropriate that in the center of the American Capitol we should see the rods without the axe blade. You'll understand why a bit later. Now here we have more clear symbolism. We have on the left the House mace from the US House of Representatives, and on the right we have another thing that can be seen in the US House of Representatives. Both of them clearly aligning with the Roman model. The one on the right has an axe blade, the one on the left does not, and symbolically for America, and this is nothing to do with ancient Rome, they have 13 rods representing the American 13 colonies. And you can see them, well, anytime you see the State of the Nation address. You can see I've put up pictures of lots of presidents just to make sure nobody gets offended. You can see there's Kennedy, there's Obama, there's Trump, and, well, this is not a partisan thing. Anytime a president speaks, you will see on either side the symbol of the Roman fasces. Now, one thing, just as a slight digression, when I was looking for some nice images of lictors online, it seemed like an enormous number of pictures came up of these strange creatures. They are Tyrannid lictors from the game Warhammer 40,000. Now, I've never played Warhammer. I have nothing against it. I'm sure it's a really fun game, so please don't get offended with me. But I'm not going to be saying anything about Warhammer or Lictors, even if there are some pretty famous people out there who really like Warhammer. We'll just leave it at that. Now, back to this British Museum artifact. As I said already, they've dated the production from around the age of Augustus, possibly early Tiberius. He's 18.4 centimeters or 7¼ inches tall, and the curator's comments, I'm quoting directly from the website of the British Museum. The symbol of the Fasces originated with the Etruscans, the earliest being found at an iron set in an Etruscan tomb of the 7th century BC at Vetilonia. Now, we'll come back to that claim, which I am skeptical of, shall we say. I'm not entirely sure that's correct, and we will come back to it. And then the next interesting fact, purchased from executives of Professor H. Scullard. Now, as soon as I saw that name, I thought, I know who that is. And he is definitely ancient history royalty as far as 20th century academics are concerned. So that reduces the chance of it being a fake. But, anytime you get an artifact from the ancient world, you really want to know its provenance. And its provenance here is really rather recent. We don't even have the word of Scullard about where he got it, because he was dead when it was purchased by the British Museum, and most of his items were actually donated to King's College London. So how the British Museum came to acquire it, and more importantly, how Scullard himself acquired it, well, we just don't know. I mean, I'm kind of nervous. Was he just on vacation? He saw it for sale in a souvenir shop and bought it? Well, on what basis was this verified as ancient Roman? Well, there's no details from the British Museum to tell us that. Now, who was H. Scullard? Well, you can see I've given you his dates here. Professor of Ancient History at King's College London. Now, he's probably most well known as the editor of the Oxford Classical Dictionary, which is an absolutely wonderful series. I would say 2nd edition is good, 3rd edition is good. I actually own the 3rd edition and the 4th edition, because when the 4th edition came out, they said, lots of new entries, really, really new, really, really changed and different. So I went ahead and bought the 4th edition, thinking it would be a major revision, and it wasn't. I felt quite ripped off, if you ask me. So if you're looking to acquire a copy, the 3rd editions are actually pretty cheap online, because there's now a 4th edition up. But honestly, I think the 3rd edition is every bit as good. Now, the reason I know him was because he revised and partly rewrote Cary's A History of Rome down to the reign of Constantine. Now, this is Scullard himself. He seems to have been a very private man. He never married, lived with his parents until they died, and then lived with friends until he died. And there seems to be exactly one picture of him floating around, and it comes from a publication of the British Academy, and it has some fearsome copyright things, so I'm acknowledging where I got it. Please don't sue me. It comes from the obituary written by another gentleman of what I'd call ancient history royalty, and that is Walbank, another major name in the field. And here's the book. You can see Cary and Scullard. Normally you think it's a co-authored book, but in fact Cary wrote the first editions, and then after he was dead, his widow asked Scullard, who had studied under Cary, if he would write an updated version. And so it comes from 1975. Now, I have a special attachment to this book and this particular cover. If you'd buy it now, you'll probably get a different cover, but that's the cover of the original edition that I purchased, because when I was taking Roman history in my very first year at university when I was 18 years old, this was the textbook we were told to buy. And I've been using it ever since. Now, I've been teaching Roman history at university for well over 20 years now. And one of the benefits of being a Roman history professor is every time a new potential textbook comes out, I can contact the publisher and say, hey, could you send me a free copy, please? A review copy, so I can see if I want my students to buy it. So I've looked at a number of the more recent publications, and none of them, in my opinion, were ever nearly as good as Kerry and Scullard. It really is a fantastic textbook, a general edition. If somebody wanted to know, I don't know much about the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic, what's the one book I should read first? I would tell you, this is that book. Now, perhaps more well known for some readers at least, is from the Gracchi to Nero, A History of Rome from 133 BC to AD 68, covers a shorter time period, and he wrote it on his own. So that's another good one, but I still prefer the earlier book. Now, when I was looking up this on this website, Goodreads, I couldn't help noticing down here, this section here, with 58 people are currently reading the book. And when you enlarge the image of that fellow in the middle, this is the photo he chose to use for his online profile. I have no idea who he is, what his name is, but that's an interesting photo. So this fellow with his boxing gloves, please don't punch me, is currently reading from the Gracchi to Nero. Who is he and why did he choose that photo? I don't know, but I thought it was quite funny. Now, we don't actually have many examples of little lictors like we have at the British Museum. I looked around and these were pretty much all of the others that I could find. The Art Institute of Chicago has one. You can see his rods are a little different and there's no obvious axe blade. He's also pretty small, even smaller than the 7-inch one in the British Museum. And again, you can see there on the screen, I've given you the provenance from their website. And again, it's very unclear where it came from. We have the names of some collectors from the 20th century, and it's been dated to the first 50 years AD, but exactly where it was found, how it came into these people's hands, no information is given. Then we have a couple at German museums, one in Munich and one in Hanover. Again, pretty similar artifacts, where they're from, what they were for, where they were originally found, all those questions, well, unknown, which is really rather annoying. Now here we have another object that'll help inform us a little bit because, well, it's also from the British Museum, in fact, although I do not think it's on public display. And first, again, while I'm on this little topic, bequeathed by Charles Hirsch, acquisition date 2002. Okay, but where was it before 2002? Was it part of a coin hoard? Was it dug out of a tomb? Was it found in Rome? Was it found in Britain? No information is provided. It's really rather frustrating. And the description from the British Museum, Lucius Junius Brutus, walking left between two lictors carrying fasces, preceded by an acensus. Now, I find it funny they had to use the Latin term acensus because it just means an attendant, preceded by an attendant, but sounds so much more fancy and erudite if you say it's an acensus. Now, Lucius Junius Brutus was the Brutus who participated in expelling the kings from Rome, not the one who stabbed Julius Caesar. Marcus Junius Brutus, the moneyer who was behind having this artwork on a coin, he's the one who about 10 years later will in fact participate in the assassination of Julius Caesar. At this point, he's just harking back to his famous ancestor, I guess for a bit of self-promotion, and nobody could really blame him since he was such an important figure in the establishment of the Republic. Now, back to that claim from the British Museum about how the fasces originate from the Etruscans and an Etruscan town called Vetulonia, which you can see on the map. And here is Silius Italicus's claim from his poem about the Punic Wars, Punica, which he wrote in the 1st century AD. Vetulonia, once the pride of the Lydian race. From that city come the 12 bundles of rods that are borne before the consul, and also the 12 axes with their silent menace. She adorned the high curule chairs with the beauty of ivory, and first bordered the robe of office with Tyrian purple, and the brazen trumpet which inflames the warrior was her invention also. Very poetic, well, it is an epic poem. But before we even go into the claim of whether the fasces come from Vetulonia, I want to address this comment about the pride of the Lydian race. This is based on an idea that Etruscans and Etruscan civilization actually came from the east. You will find Lydia in modern-day Turkey. And there are quite a lot of Etruscan artifacts that do indeed look similar to the civilizations from the Middle East and the Greek world, the Bronze Age Greek world. But while we're sure they had trade and communications and definitely borrowed a lot of concepts, the question of whether the Etruscans were actually indigenous or immigrants has recently been answered by ancient DNA. They've managed to recover the DNA from some ancient bones in Etruscan tombs, and the answer was the Etruscans are autochthonous. And if you don't know what autochthonous means, it means indigenous. They come from Italy. They are genetically the same as other Italian native peoples. So that question, which I honestly thought would never get answered in the last couple of years, we've actually finally got an answer for it. So even the claim that the Etruscans came from the East in this quote is false. What about the claim that this is where the idea of lictors and fasces come from? Well, there's a second claim. This is Titus Livius, better known as Livy, from Book 1. Now, I'm not going to assume you know Latin, so let's translate this into English. There we go. Once he had properly carried out the religious rites, this is Romulus they're talking about, by the way. Once he had properly carried out the religious rites and summoned the people to an assembly, since nothing but shared laws could unite them into a single body politic, Romulus gave them a code of laws. He believed that a rough, uncivilized people would only respect these laws if he made himself an awe-inspiring figure through the trappings of power. So he adopted a more majestic bearing overall, and in particular he surrounded himself with 12 lictors as attendants. Some believe he chose this number of lictors because it involved the birds. There's a typo there, I beg your pardon. Because of the 12 birds that had appeared to him in augury, foretelling his kingship. For my part, I'm happy to follow those who argue that both the institution of lictors and their number were borrowed from Rome's Etruscan neighbours, the same source as the curule chair and the toga praetexta. The Etruscans, it is said, used 12 lictors because their kings were elected jointly by the 12 Etruscan cities, with each city contributing one lictor. Now, I want you to be careful here. You will read in Wikipedia and various books and other things all of this information as a certain fact. First off, even Livy himself is not saying this is definitely true. He offers two possible theories that other people believe. He says, I prefer one of the theories. This is a possibility. Even he, an ancient Roman, is honest enough to say this is merely a theory, a possibility. Some people believe this might have been true. Now, unfortunately, these kind of quotes have a power of their own. So when archaeologists dug up an Etruscan tomb in Babylonia and found this artifact you see on the right, they immediately called the tomb of the Lictor, because clearly this object they'd dug up was the original Etruscan fasces. After all, the Roman sources told us it was so. Now, it's about 2 feet long, which is much too short. Perhaps it's broken off lower down, but that's not what the length of the fasces. Considerably too small. It's all metal. The fasces were mostly wood with a single axe blade, and this one has a double axe blade. So is this even anything to do with lictors or all these traditions? Well, I'm not as confident as, well, the British Museum for a start, and various others. Now, there's a better photo of what you're looking at. Very, very rusted. And part of the problem is, as you'll also see from this Etruscan tomb from the same city on the right, with the double axe head, this is described as bipennis. It comes from the Latin for 2 wings, essentially. It's the term archaeologists use for the double-headed axe, the bipennis axe. And Roman fasces never had the 2 heads. And we were just talking about the influence from the East. And here we have some Minoan artifacts with very similar double-headed axe blades. Here we have a picture of a Mycenaean object, also with the double-headed axe. The double-headed axe seems to harken back to the Etruscan contacts with the Eastern civilizations and the influence upon Etruscan artifacts. I'm doubtful that this is in fact evidence of where Roman fasces came from. Now, we do have this object from a Etruscan museum in Volterra, and it does seem to show a bunch of Etruscans carrying their rods. The problem is, this is from the 2nd century BC. This is after all of these cities have been under Roman rule for a long, long time. So you can't say this is an artifact representing ancient Etruscan civilization. This very well may just simply represent the influence of Roman civilization upon the Etruscan cities. Now, let's just go back to this point I was making about how these Roman authors don't know. We have a tendency to lump all ancient sources together and consider them to be primary evidence. But when historians talk about primary evidence, they mean about eyewitness accounts. Now, Livy Book 1 was probably written about 25 BC, and the poem, the Punica, was probably written about 90 AD. Now, I want to give you a sense of perspective here. Rome, by tradition, was founded in 753 BC. This photo on the right I actually took at the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and it's an artist's reconstruction of what the first settlement upon the Capitoline might have looked like, with thatched huts, just a little village, frankly, but 753 BC. That's many centuries before Livy or Italicus were writing these descriptions, many centuries. Now, to give you a sense of scale, the time between Livy and the foundation of Rome, if we take 2026 AD as our starting point, that would take us back to the Battle of Falkirk, where the English got their revenge on William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, and finally defeated him in 1298 AD. So if somebody in 2026 was writing an account of the Battle of Falkirk, and we had almost no evidence of any intermediary sources, we're not going to be terribly trusting of the accounts. You might as well take Mel Gibson's movie Braveheart as an historical documentary, which I hope you realize you can't do. And for Italicus, well, the gap between him and the foundation of Rome would be the same as the gap between 2026 and the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. Again, if we were getting accounts from somebody today telling us all about Frederick Barbarossa, the famous red-bearded emperor, well, again, we would be highly skeptical. How do you know that so many centuries later? What's the source of your information? And the sad part is we actually don't know the answer to these questions. Now, again, I just really want to hammer this home. So there we have on the left, 753, founding of Rome. The oldest Roman historian, the first Roman historian to write about the history of his own country, was Quintus Fabius Pictor, and I've given you his dates. He's in the 3rd century BCE. He was a veteran of the Second Punic War. He, in fact, wrote in Greek, even though he was a Roman writing a history of Rome. They were taking the influence of the Greek idea of writing history and saying, this is a good idea, I want to do that. Some argue that he was writing for a Greek-speaking audience. And then we know that Livy did in fact use Fabius Pictor as a source, but that's still 500 years between the period of Fabius Pictor and the founding of Rome. How did they know? They didn't know, to be honest. A lot of it was legend, there might have been some inscriptions, a lot of it would have been simple tradition, which is not very reliable. So just because Livy says something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It means that's a tradition. The Romans believed it might have been true of their early history, which wasn't recorded. But having given you those warnings, let's go back and use the sources, because the sad fact is our sources aren't very good, our sources aren't very reliable, but if we don't use our sources, well, what have we got? And the answer is not a lot. So here's a quote from Livy Book 2. It's from the life, in fact, of Lucius Junius Brutus, who I mentioned before, one of the founders of the Roman Republic, who had participated in kicking the kings out of Rome. And, well, I'll read the quote. "The consuls took their seats. The lictors were told off to inflict the penalty. They scourged their bared backs with rods and then beheaded them." Reason, of course, I've had that quote in there is to show you that these rods and axes were not merely symbolic. We have a story here where they were beaten with the sticks and then beheaded with the axes. These are practical weapons that were in fact used. The story itself in this painting from the 1700s is showing that story was that the sons of Brutus had actually been participating in a rebellion against the early republic. And Brutus, being patriotic and putting the state above the needs of his own family, ordered his own children to be executed. So there we have Brutus sitting on the chair as the bodies of his own children are delivered to his house. And of course, there's his wife and daughters looking on as their family members are delivered to their house. Now we have Livy 255 here, another example of the kind of things lictors might be doing in ancient Rome. "After they had excited one another by these speeches, Valero Publilius, a plebeian, said that he ought not to be made a common soldier after serving as a centurion. The consuls sent a lictor to him. Valero appealed to the tribunes. None came to his assistance, so the consuls ordered him to be stripped, and the rods got ready. 'I appeal to the people,' he said, 'since the tribunes would rather see a Roman citizen scourged before their eyes than be murdered in their beds by you.' The more excitedly he called out, the more violently did the lictor tear off his toga to strip him. Then Valero, himself a man of unusual strength, and helped by those to whom he called, drove the lictor off, and amidst the indignant remonstrances of his supporters, retreated into the thickest part of the crowd, crying out, 'I appeal to the plebs for protection. Help, fellow citizens. Help, fellow soldiers. You have nothing to expect from the tribunes. They themselves need your aid.' The men, greatly excited, got ready as if for battle, and a most critical struggle was evidently impending, where no one would show the slightest respect for either public or private rights. The consuls tried to check the fury of the storm, but they soon found that there is little safety for authority without strength. The lictors were mobbed, the fasces broken, and the consuls driven from the forum into the Senate house, uncertain how far Valero would push his victory." So this is from a time period in the early days of the Republic called the conflict of the orders. There's a lot of tensions between the plebeians and the patricians, which are roughly the upper and lower class, although not exactly, and how the plebeians were increasingly forcing political compromises to give them a fair say. And in fact, Valero himself was later elected as a tribune, so I guess this violent quasi-rebellion, was rewarded by his fellow plebeians. Then we have another source, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, in his book Roman Antiquities. "After the consuls had settled these matters, fearing, as I suspect, that the masses might gain a false impression of their new form of government, and imagine that 2 kings had become masters of the state instead of 1, since each of the consuls had 12 axes, like the kings, they resolved to quiet the fears of the citizens, and to lessen the hatred of their power, by ordering that one of the consuls should be preceded by the 12 axes, and the other 12 lictors with rods only, or, as some relate, with clubs also, and that they should receive the axes in rotation, each consul possessing them in turn 1 month. By this, and not a few other measures of like nature, they cause the plebeians and the lower class to be eager for a continuance of the existing order." So this is again part of this conflict of the orders, a bit of compromise. So they won't both carry axes around, only one at a time will have axes, the other will have the rods without the axes. So this was a form, if you like, of showing, well, we're still rotating power, we're not like the kings of old, quieting the anxiety of the plebeians that they might once again be put under the power of somebody like a monarch. But once again, I've given you the dates here of Dionysius, and you can see he's only 1st century BC, a long way removed from the events he's describing. And then here's another passage from the same guy. "After the death of Brutus, his colleague Valerius became suspected by the people of a design to make himself king. Desiring to give the plebeians a definite pledge of their liberty, he took the axes from the rods and established it as a precedent for his successors in the consulship, a precedent which continued to be followed down to my day, that when they were outside the city, they should use the axes, but inside the city, they should be distinguished by the rods only. So we have a piece-by-piece compromise. Originally, both the senior leaders are marching around with their 12 lictors and their fasces. Then we have a compromise of rotating them. Then we have a further compromise that as long as you're within the city boundaries, you won't have the axes with you. Now, the problem is, these aren't definitive statements about this is Roman law, this is Roman tradition, it was always done like this in every year of the Roman Republic. These are merely descriptions of particular events that happened at particular occasions, and modern historians have had a tendency simply to extrapolate it all out and say, well, that's obviously how the Romans always did things. Well, it might be, but the sad fact of the matter is, we really don't know. So much of what we know just comes from these little snippets. This, by the way, is why I'm quoting a lot of ancient texts, because I'm bringing to you almost all of the quotes that tell us anything about the consulships, not the consulships, the lictorships, and the traditions of carrying the fasces. Are they exactly true? Well, now you can be the judge because you can look at the evidence for yourself. Now, I was also lucky enough to have a recent trip to northern Italy, and I was in Verona, and you can see here up on the other side of the river from the main old township of Verona, they have the archaeological museum on the other side of the river, and they have in this museum a picture of a lictor with the fasces. You can see there's no axe blades, so it's probably representative of being within the sacred boundary of the city. And also there's some funny things poking out the end. They definitely don't look like axe blades. What are they? Well, sadly, we don't actually know. Now we have various other examples, and I've tried to show you a good number of them. This one comes from the Altar of Peace, the Areopagus, which you can go and see if you visit Rome. Well worth a visit. It was broken and buried, and then most of the pieces were found and reconstructed. Sadly, the section we're interested in was particularly badly broken, and also annoying because the figure on the right, whose head you can see and not much of his body, we think that is probably Augustus, and wouldn't we love to have seen the complete version of Augustus? And over on the top left of this picture, you can see 3 sets of fasces. So presumably these guys in front of him are the lictors who are escorting Augustus through the streets while he's going to make sacrifices on behalf of the state. Now, I've mentioned the sacred boundary and the tradition of not having the axe blades while inside it, so I better pause for a moment to explain what that is. The Romans called it the pomerium, and it was very much a sacred boundary. You might think of it in a similar fashion to when people consecrate a church. It's not just the building, it's the land it sits on, and there will be a boundaries, which is the church land that has been consecrated, and then on the other side of that line, it's just, regular land. And in the stories of Romulus and Remus from the original founding of Rome, Romulus and Remus had an argument, and you're probably familiar with this. Of course, Romulus then murdered Remus, so the legend goes. And the main cause of him murdering his brother was that he had ploughed the sacred boundary, and Remus disrespected it and leapt over it, and then Romulus killed him in a rage. So it was not something just to be ignored, it was something important to the Romans. And if you've seen HBO's Rome, there's one short little scene which is easy to miss, where Mark Antony comes in, and there's Cato the Younger looking terribly grumpy, and he says, "What are you doing entering the sacred boundary of Rome wearing military garb?" And Mark Antony goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm such an idiot. Will you please forgive me?" And he's obviously not very sorry, and he's kind of grinning and mocking Cato, but if you go back and watch the episode, you'll know it's because you're not supposed to wear military equipment across the pomerium. Soldiers and generals returning from campaign were supposed to take off their military gear, change into civilian garb before ever crossing the pomerium. About the only exception that was ever made to this was when a general was voted a triumph, and then the general and his soldiers could march across the sacred boundary, but only after a vote of the Senate. Now, this particular piece here from the 2nd century AD has caused a lot of needless argument, in my opinion. You can see there's clearly a couple of lictors with their fasces over their arms, and then there's a guy who's just got an axe blade. And the arguments have been about, well, hang on a minute, here we have a lictor, and he's obviously got an axe blade, but you're not supposed to be inside the pomerium with the axes and all the rest. I think the simple answer here is he's not a lictor. You see the dead ox on the ground at his feet. That isn't the axe for sacrificing the oxen. He's been taking part in the religious festival. I don't think, just because you're standing next to the lictors and there's an axe there, I don't think we need to say, oh dear, he's a lictor with an axe blade. I do not think that's the case at all. I think that's a pointless argument, frankly. And then we have another one here, where we have Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man, from the Areopagus, and you can see there's various figures and people have tried to identify who they are. And on the left, we have some priests who've got these very interesting, strange little hats on. And we have this one guy with an axe. Now, again, because he's accompanying the priests, I would say the same thing. He's there for the ritual sacrifice of the animals, and this is an altar upon which we see these pictures. But in this case, there's a possibility he could be a kind of lictor, because Plutarch does tell us that the Flamen Dialis, one particular priest who had all sorts of weird and wonderful rules associated with him, one of which was he was never allowed to leave the city of Rome, we're told that he got one lictor to escort him around. So he could very well be a lictor. And then we have Polybius, the famous Greek historian and a guy who's absolutely in love with the Roman Empire. He was taken as a hostage, but he lived in the house of Scipio Aemilianus, and he became absolutely pro-Roman. And here is what he had to say. By the way, I hope you'll forgive me that I made it look like a illuminated medieval manuscript. That's just my own image, but anyway, let's read it out. The Romans had appointed as dictator Quintus Fabius, a man of admirable judgment and great natural gifts, so much so that still in my own day the members of this family bear the name Maximus. A dictator differs from the consuls in these respects, that while each of the consuls is attended by 12 lictors, the dictator has 24, and that while the consuls require in many matters the cooperation of the Senate, the dictator is with absolute powers, all the magistrates in Rome except the tribunes ceasing to hold office on his appointment. When the dictator is created, all magistrates in the city of Rome resigned, except the military tribunes, nor did anyone else have command except him. Now, modern scholars have taken this to imply that while the consuls are not supposed to have the axe blades among their fasces when they're inside the pomerium, that the dictator was in fact allowed it. So not only would he have 24 lictors, they would all have their axe blades because he was supreme power in the state. And I've read this again, stated definitively, this is the truth. This is Roman law. But in fact, it's all implied by this and a couple of other quotes I won't bore you with. We have no ancient sources that actually state it. It's simply, well, the consuls are only allowed to have the axe blades outside the pomerium. Well, by implication, that means maybe the dictators are allowed it. Well, it might be true, but I think it's a bit of a stretch to say it's a definite fact. Now, the normal picture, and it's the nice simple one that everybody knows, is that the dictator gets 24 lictors, the consuls get 12 each, and the praetors, the next step down in power in terms of Roman magistrates, they get 6 lictors each. For the earlier period of the Middle Republic, at least, there were 6 lictors. After the age of Sulla, a few more got added, but we'll just go with 6 for now. And we have here Appian writing the history of the Syrian wars. When the Romans heard of the eruption of Antiochus into Greece and the killing and capture of Romans at Delium, they declared war. For these reasons, the Romans sent forces into all the provinces of Greece to watch them without provoking hostilities. With them were sent commanders called 6 axe men, so called because the consuls had 12 bundles of rods and axes, as the kings before them had, whereas the praetors had only half the dignity of the consuls and half the number of insignia of office. Okay, well, that seems pretty straightforward, but once again, Appian is in the period of the Roman Empire, post-Augustus, and he's describing Roman magistrates outside of Italy representing the Roman state. Now, it's probably true that praetors got 6 each, but again, these quotes do a lot of work. We then extrapolate that out. It's surprisingly few places who spell it out. I guess part of the problem is the Romans knew this stuff. They didn't feel the need to explain it to us. We don't have a nice textbook that lays it out. Let me tell you about the Roman laws and traditions and customs of the lictors and the fasces. We simply don't have it. We're left with little jigsaw pieces like this that we then have to assemble. And, well, I deliberately chose a picture here of perhaps a Roman fellow looking rather confused because nobody really knows what to do with this passage from Cassius Dio. And he's describing at this point the Augustan organization of the empire, and here's the quote. So, then, he caused the appointed governors to be known as propraetors and to hold office for as much longer than a year as should please them. All the propraetors alike employ 5 lictors. Now, it wasn't until I started researching this episode that I had even seen this quote, and I'd never heard anybody refer to certain Roman magistrates being accompanied by 5 lictors. Now, one possibility is that Cassius Dio was simply mistaken. He was born maybe 160 AD, died about 235 AD, so he's well into the empire, but on the other hand, he was pretty important, and even though he was a Greek and writing in Greece, he had actually been a consul of Rome. So you would think he would know, but, well, we really don't know what to do with this. Why would some guys get 5? We don't know. Now, to add to the confusion, it's a much later source. It's the Digest of Justinian, a legal codex that guided a lot of European law, even down to the present day. And it was compiling a lot of legal precedents from early in the empire. Now, Ulpian, he is also from the 200s AD, so a little bit earlier perhaps than Cassius Dio, but not by a lot. And in one passage he comments, proconsuls are only entitled to 6 lictors. Now, proconsuls, propraetors, they both essentially fulfill the same functions. They would sometimes lead armies, more likely govern provinces and things like this, and the terms are used more or less interchangeably during the empire for different governors, and this quote that they're limited to 6 lictors, which does suggest to me that Cassius Dio was mistaken, or perhaps it's in fact just a problem that a medieval copyist got it wrong, saw the number 6, mistook it for the number 5, and it's simply a copyist's error, because almost all manuscripts we have come from a copy of a copy of a copy from sometime in the Middle Ages. We almost never get an original source that dates back to the Roman Empire. Now, here we have a statue in Rome that I took on a vacation a few years back, and on the pedestal, SPQR, the symbol of the Senate and people of Rome, we have Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator perpetuo, permanent dictator for life, not like Cincinnatus, who we mentioned, who lay it aside as quick as possible. The dictatorship was a constitutional position, but it was only for a maximum of 6 months. I remember, in fact, being in the city of Rome and reading that and thinking, yeah, he kind of deserved to get stabbed, didn't he? This is a republic, every bit as much as the United States is a republic. America is proud of having kicked out the kings and established a republic. And the idea of somebody going around saying, well, no, we'll restore the monarchy, I'll be a king again. Well, this is almost it. It's not the rotation of power, it is, I am president for life. I'm not limited by 2 terms, I have been appointed president forever. Well, what do you think would happen in America if somebody declared that? Well, Rome had been a republic for about 500 years by this point and was very proud that the name of king was intolerable at Rome. Well, what's the difference between a king and a perpetual dictator? Now, let me give you some stories associated with Julius Caesar and lictors. Well, before I do that, some background to why these things I'm going to tell you were so horrifying to the Romans and would have contributed to people's decision to murder him. So, Livy, Book 3, going back to the early Republic. Some context, this is the age of the Decemvirs, a council of 10 who took over and ruled Rome, initially probably quite nicely, but then it looked like they were going to try to establish a dictatorship of a council of 10, and eventually they were forced out because people were not willing to accept this, even in the early Republic. So here's the quote. The previous Decemvirs had observed the rule of only having the Fasces at a time and making this emblem of royalty go to each in turn. Now all the 10 suddenly appeared, each with his 12 lictors. The forum was filled with 120 lictors, and they bore the axes tied up in the Fasces. The Decemvirs explained it by saying that as they were invested with absolute power of life and death, there was no reason for the axes being removed. They presented the appearance of 10 kings, and manifold fears were entertained not only by the lowest classes, but even by the foremost of the senators. They felt that a pretext for commencing bloodshed was being sought for, so that if anyone uttered, either in the Senate or amongst the people, a single word which reminded them of liberty, the rods and axes would instantly be made ready for him to intimidate the rest. Having a huge collection of 120 lictors all gathered together was a sign that people were aiming at monarchy, and all ranks of society disliked it. So this is the historical precedent. Now let's look at the time period of Julius Caesar. Back to Appian describing the civil wars. In the meantime, Caesar, who had performed the many brilliant exploits in Gaul and Britain, had returned with vast riches to Cisalpine Gaul on the River Po. Now, Cisalpine Gaul, as a brief digression, is Gaul this side of the Alps, as opposed to Transalpine Gaul, which was Gaul on the far side of the Alps. And of course, we're thinking from the point of view of the Romans, so Italian Gaul. We would today find cities like Milan and Verona and Venice in what the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul. So it's actually Italy as far as we're concerned. Okay. He had returned with his army to Cisalpine Gaul. From this district he sent large sums of money to many persons in Rome, to those who were holding the yearly offices, and to persons otherwise distinguished as governors and generals, and they went thither by turns to meet him. So many of them came that 120 lictors could be seen around him at one time, and more than 200 senators, some returning thanks for what they had already received, others asking for money or seeking some other advantage for themselves from the same quarter. So I do not think it's a coincidence that we get this number, 120 lictors. Now, because we've got consuls visiting, we've got praetors visiting, all of the people who are entitled to have lictors with their fasces, but it's a bad omen, a sign of tyranny when you see so many lictors all gathered together. Well, that's before the civil wars have broken out. Then we have a story from after the civil wars, after Julius Caesar's victory. They had granted Julius Caesar permission to ride in the triumph, in a chariot drawn by white horses, and to be accompanied by all the lictors who were then with him, and by as many others as he had employed in his first dictatorship, together with as many more as he had in his second. Now, this is a really rather strange statement, and again, a lot of scholarly ink has been spilled trying to unpack it. But if you get 24 lictors when you're a dictator, and there were 24 lictors in a previous dictatorship, do we just add the 24 plus the 24? Or is it referring to individuals who had once been lictors who are allowed to come back, which doesn't necessarily mean it's 24 plus 24 and so on. Exactly how many lictors It's a strange description from Cassius Dio. I think he's probably a bit confused himself, but a lot of lictors, put it that way. He celebrated triumphs on 4 separate days. Most of it, of course, delighted the spectators, but the sight of the host of lictors and the symbols of triumph taken from the citizens who had fallen in Africa displeased them exceedingly. The lictors, on account of their numbers, appeared to them a most offensive multitude, since never before had they beheld so many at one time. So any one individual with too many lictors is bad news. It's going to create a sense of resentment, a sense of fear. This guy wants to be a tyrant. This guy wants to be a king. I'm not saying it's the only factor that led to people deciding that Julius Caesar had to be murdered, but it definitely is an important factor. Now, let's look at a little bit of other evidence to try and reconstruct a little bit more about these lictors. Now, the Cancellaria reliefs are now held in the Vatican Museum, and we think they were originally commissioned by Domitian, but were later altered after his death. If you know your Roman history, you'll know Domitian was considered a tyrant. He was assassinated, and he was replaced by Nerva. And if you look here on the screen, I'll point it out here with my cursor, you can see this face here. People believe that this face has been recarved, plus some other faces. They think it was probably showing Domitian setting out on a military campaign to fight the barbarians up on the Danube frontier, the Chatti. But again, I've put question marks there because this is what we believe, and it very well might be true, but we don't know this to be a certain fact. And you can see there, we have clearly a couple of lictors over on the far left. And here's a close-up from another part of the scene showing another lictor, and you can see the axe blades, you can see the rods, you can see the tying up. You can see they're not nearly as thick as the ones we see in these American examples, but the American examples have too many rods because of the symbolism of having 13 rods for the 13 colonies. Roman sets of rods were clearly not nearly as many and not nearly as thick. Now here's another section here. You can see the axe blade is relatively low down. You can see the way he's holding it. It doesn't come down a long way. Well, it projects a long way up in the sky. And if you look carefully at the end of those rods, you have those funny little tufty things, which reminds me of that one I showed you a bit earlier from Verona. What are they? Well, again, I'm not sure. I wonder if you cut these rods of wood and they're still a bit green, there could still be a little bit of growth. They might even spout some leaves. I wonder if sometimes the Fasces actually sprouted a few leaves, and this is what those little things at the end are representing. Now, here's a pencil drawing of another section of the same set of reliefs. And one thing I find quite curious here, we seem to have different types of rods. You'll see the circle on the left is a little bit curved, but clearly sets of rods all twined together. And on the right, they're much straighter and much more similar to the ones we're more used to seeing in the way they're tied up. So what's going on here? Well, if we look at this lictor that I showed you from an earlier slide, you can see his sets are a little bit bent and look quite a lot similar to this one we see there. While my piece from the British Museum much more closely resembles the other set. Now, we're really not sure what's going on here, but if we go back, we can see that the guy on the left is accompanying some female figures. Now, these are probably Vestal Virgins, and I've got some quotes later to show that we know that a Vestal Virgin could be accompanied by a single lictor. Perhaps the fasces that were carried by the lictor that would guard a Vestal Virgin was different from the fasces that would be used to guard a politician. And in fact, if you went a little bit further along on this relief, you would see there are figures that are clearly, military and political figures. So perhaps that's what's going on. We have fasces for Vestal Virgins being different from fasces for praetors and consuls and dictators. Well, that's one possibility. We don't really know. Now, we have this quote here, back to Cassius Dio again from Book 53. This is another short passage upon which multiple academic articles have been written, arguing the point back and forth, and what does this really mean? The shorter answer is we don't know. But here's the quote. The following year, Caesar, Julius Caesar this is, held office for the 6th time and confirmed in all other respects to the usages handed down from the earliest times, in particular, I'm sorry, it's not Julius Caesar, it's Augustus. I've muddled myself up with a very common mistake because Octavian, as we call him, never called himself Octavian. From the moment he was adopted by Julius Caesar, he called himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. That was a name to conjure with, that was a name to gain the loyalty of the troops, etc. So Julius Caesar, in the time of Augustus, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, is in fact the guy that the history books call Octavian. I muddle myself in the same way that so many other people do. Okay, it's Augustus. The following year, Caesar held office for the 6th time and confirmed in all other respects to the usages handed down from the earliest times, and in particular he delivered to Agrippa, his colleague, the bundles of rods, as it was incumbent upon him to do, while he himself used the other set, and on completing his term of office, he took the oath according to ancestral custom. So what does this mean? There's one set of fasces, or bundles of rods, and then there's a different set that is somehow different from the original set. And Augustus, showing that he wasn't trying to hold on to supreme power, looks like he gave the better set to Agrippa and kept the lesser set for himself. Is it referring to something like these different kinds of fasces? And if this argument interests you, you could try Googling the debate about the dummy rods. There's a whole long argument. Sir Ronald Syme and other major historians have argued about it down through the years. Was there sort of a set of fake fasces and a set of real fasces and they swapped them out? Or does it mean they had the axes? Or what does it mean? The short version is, dunno. That's the honest answer. Now, if you're interested in this topic and want to read more about it, you might check out the book The Fasces by T. Corey Brennan. Now, it's a good book and lots of interesting things in it, but I do want to quibble about one thing he says in his book. He says that the fasces were carried upside down in funeral processions to signify the end of authority. Now, I thought this was a very interesting claim, and I went looking for ancient sources to verify it. And the fact is, there aren't any ancient sources. None of our ancient Greek or ancient Roman sources say anything of the kind. His claim is based on this tomb, and in fact, this picture from a 18th century pencil engraving showing the tomb of Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Hispalis, who died as a consul while in office. And if you look there, you can see that there are 12 fasces, because he was a consul, on either side of his tomb. But let's zoom in a little bit on this image. Well, yes, the axe blades are rather low, but are they inverted? Are the fasces upside down? Well, I've already shown you a number of pictures where the fasces are being carried like that, and the axe blades are rather low. Now, especially here, look where the axe handles are running. They're running down to the base of the fasces. These are not upside down. These are not inverted. And artistically for the tomb, you'll see how the axe blades carefully align with the top of the tomb. So I don't think it's accurate to say that these fasces are upside down, and that's why the axe blades are low. I think these fasces are the right way up. Perhaps the axe blades are shown a little low compared to some of the examples that we've seen of other lictors, but in fact, I've already shown you examples where the axe blades are carried that low, and the other reason, as I said, is merely an artistic one for the symmetry of the picture. So while the book overall I would recommend it, I don't think I agree with that particular claim. And you see here, there's an example. Now, my British Museum lictor, his axe blade is on the lower end, but you'll see very clearly the handle of the axe is running down. And this guy, well, you can see it's really a very similar shape to what we saw on the tomb. So I don't think the axe blades being low is any indication that they're inverted or upside down. Now, let's talk about some of the other things we don't know. We don't even know what these rods are made of because we have contradictory evidence. We have Plautus from the Asinaria. You have been detected in theft and scourged in public. You have frequently reduced to wariness 8 sturdy lictors armed with pliant twigs of elm. Well, this quote is taken to mean that the rods in the Fasces are made from elm trees. On the other hand, Pliny the Elder, a pretty respectable source, the birch is a Gallic tree of a remarkable white colour and slenderness, a cause of terror as supplying the magistrates' rods of office. Well, neither one of them say that, oh, sometimes we use elm, sometimes we use birch, which is what I've seen in modern sources. They just contradict each other. Did tradition change over time? Did they just use whatever wood was available? We don't know. This is a contradiction in our sources. And by the way, those are the sum total of the quotes to tell us what wood those rods were made out of. But maybe they were made out of a third wood sometimes, for all we know. Then we have this one. Plutarch, his life of Numa. Now, Numa was the second king of Rome who came immediately after Romulus. So he's talking about very, very early history of Rome. But Numa bestowed great privileges upon the Vestal virgins, such as, when they appear in public, the fasces are carried before them. Now, we would assume if the fasces are carried before them, there's going to be a lictor with them. But then we have this piece from Cassius Dio, and he's referring to the time of Augustus. These were the honours which were... No, this is back to Julius Caesar, I'm muddling myself. These were the honours which were granted to Caesar. They also allowed the Vestal virgins to employ 1 lictor each, because one of them, not being recognised, had been insulted while returning home from dinner toward evening. So, is this an ancient custom that went back deep into the pre-Republic days of the early monarchy of Rome? Or was this a custom that was introduced in the age of Julius Caesar? Or, I don't know, we can speculate. Was it a custom that used to exist, it fell out of usage, and then it was restored? Or were the fasces carried by somebody who wasn't a lictor, and then in the age of Julius Caesar, they changed it to being a lictor? Well, that seems a bit of a reach. Again, it's a problem with our sources, and this is what happens when we try to generalize too greatly. We just have a few limited quotes, and then people have just extrapolated them. Well, this is how it's always done in the Roman Empire or Roman Republic. Well, who knows? Again, a contradiction. And then we have this funny little aside in Tacitus, Book 13. Still every honour was openly heaped upon Agrippina the younger. The Senate decreed her 2 lictors, with the office of priestess to Claudius. Now, for historical context, she had been married to Claudius, the emperor. Claudius has died. She is mother of Nero. Nero is now on the throne. They have deified Claudius. So is this an extreme and unusual honor? We have no other examples of any woman ever being allowed to have 2 lictors. Was this just a sign that Agrippina was getting above her station? We have other examples of this where Roman senators definitely felt that Agrippina was overstepping her authority and the kind of things a woman should do in Rome. Or what? It's just a isolated little quote from Tacitus that we don't know what to do with. And I've given you the most likely answers. Now, that's all I've got for you today. I don't have a definitive rundown. I just wanted to share with you all of the different possibilities, all the different stories and quotes. There are a few other quotes that I didn't share with you, but they're largely redundant and share similar information. There was a few other images I found, for example, Trajan with some lictors and things like this, but again, I didn't feel like they added anything. So I thought I would conclude with just a few things. This, for example, was an American dime. It was used from 1916 to 1945. And even the US Mint has a whole section saying, no, it's not a fascist symbol. Mussolini didn't even start using the fasces until 1919, while this design was being used in 1916. In fact, when they did the refurbishment of the Capitol it was about between 1949 and 1951, they already had fasces there, but they were going to replace them with a new set of fasces, the ones you see today, and there was lots of debate about whether they should get rid of it because, of course, By the late 1940s, World War II has been and gone. Everybody knew the symbolism of the Fasces had been used by Mussolini, and so some people thought, well, maybe we shouldn't use it in American democracy, but others said, no, why should we let a bunch of scumbag fascist, so-called fascist Europeans make us stop using a symbol that we were using long before European fascism ever came around as a thing? And so the decision was made to retain the Fasces in the US House of Representatives. Now, just a couple more images. This is a picture from late last year, late 2025, when I was in Tuscany, which is, of course, the modern name for the land of the Etruscans. So it's possible this is the land from which the Fasces and the Lictors originated. And besides which, it's a nice, I'll call it a palate cleanser. Isn't that a beautiful countryside? And the last one is simply to say, well, if anybody asks you, have you thought about the Roman Empire today? Well, you've thought a lot about the Roman Empire, and in particular about the symbolism of the Lictor and the Fasces. And thank you, and I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of Objects in the Rearview Mirror.